Ruben, how are you? Can you hear me? I can't hear you. Oh, you can unmute yourself. Yeah, you should be okay, right?
I'm here.
Okay. So,
Get the lighting right. Hold on 1 second.
okay, no problem.
Pitfalls of being in a hotel.
Still in Florida?
No, I'm in California.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's right. You're a busy guy. Good. All right. I'm just looking for like, there's like 5 people in, but I don't see anyone who's, oh, here comes Dave. All right. So in terms of getting it started, like what I said earlier is I'll just have a 2-minute hi, this is who we are, kick it over to Dave to sort of tee it up and introduce you as moderator, and then you'll go from there. Is that cool? And then when it comes to like Q, like I'll let you do all the moderating and emceeing and calling on people and stuff like that. If you need me to help out with chat or questions or write any of that, just let me know, and I'll or if you need me to unmute or anything like that, just let me know.
Yeah, so I just had Lizzie just sent me a message and said if there's anything I need, and I just said I need for someone to take notes and moderate the chat, because what I'll say is if you have questions, and you please put your questions in the chat until we get to the open discussion.
Right. Perfect.
I'm going to keep us. This is an hour and a half discussion or an hour?
It's an hour and a half. Yeah. So, don't feel you don't have to rush. I mean, you know that already, but
yeah.
And
just letting...
Ruben, I asked Kenny, so he and I spoke for a few minutes about some other stuff, and he's nervous because he knows he can sort of get on the soapbox when he's going. I said, why don't you convert things to questions sometimes, saying, "Hey, Ruben, but what about this issue?" Where he tosses a question back out to you if there's a lull or there's something he wants brought out, but he feels he's going to be too oppressive to the conversation. He's going to do that and try to turn it back to you so you can moderate it that way.
Yeah, I think so. I had a good game plan for that too, right? And I kind of thought about how to handle that in that section, in that period, or if that comes up. And basically, without, it's a real delicate way to do it, but I would just say, what does anyone else think about what Kenny's speaking about, right?
Right.
And then
right.
Kenny will, it'll give anybody else on the panel, like, what does anybody else on the panel think about, what we're discussing. So we're really going to keep it in a town hall. We had the 3 framed questions, but we decided to start with one question and talk about the definition of social equity, and then let it just flow naturally like we do in our group discussion, and let everyone see the dynamic of the group discussion.
I think that's great. I want to make sure that we also accomplish the goal of making excuse me. I want to make sure we accomplish the goal of having people understand that this is going to eventually sooner than later form itself into committee work. And Dave, when we talk about committees, talk about them in the way we did, which is tell us what you're interested in. We're putting together the committee list now, the areas that people want to focus on. So let us know, because then we'll be following up and letting people know. And then I have an appointment with Hannah tomorrow night to go over what we're going to do on the member portal. And that's where I want the committees to work, so that you can only get in if you're a member to communicate with the committee on that. So, so that, that's to come. Let me,
and Ruben, just so you know, I'm going to tee it up this way, which is, I'll ask about committees, and if people have ideas they want to put in the chat, that's great. One of the committees I've been waiting for years to form, even ahead of this, was this whole idea of social equity, which has been in the MRTA since, it first started out, and trying to find common language and common themes and denominators by which people can figure out what next to do about it. Some of those are going to be the questions you hear tonight. To help us with that, we have Ruben, our director from Hudson Valley, and I just turn it over to you. Does that work?
Sounds good.
okay.
Can you hear me, guys? Hi, guys.
This
Hey,
doesn't have to be
Lizzie.
like the Jack Parr. This doesn't need to be the Jack Parr Tonight Show. We're going to be real fluid with it. I think it's going to come off very, very, very well received.
was that a dig on my sweater?
I
Look,
think you just
I thought about wearing a blazer, but I couldn't try, I'm traveling, so.
It's all good. It's all good.
just remember,
I'm
you're
very
like
much
Zoolander.
like
You're
you always
ridiculously good looking.
Well, ridiculously.
And if you have sort of a different vibe going on, which I think really actually complement each other and say a lot about where you're coming from. So I think you're really in a great space, guys. I'm certainly sending you my energy. My ohm is coming at you.
Well, there's no place like home.
But don't boom,
And may the fourth be with you, right?
Yes, thank you.
Ah, God.
I'm just glad
How did
somebody
we
other
miss
than me
that?
said it. Thank you. That's
Oh,
it's a nod to my geekiness. You know.
Okay, so listen, I have to, I've had a familial, unfortunately, I'm having a familial meltdown that has been like, it's a little bit like 3 Mile Island. It's been heating up for a while and now we're in full blown. So
Ooh.
I'm gonna sign off at 6:30. But I will, I'll be around probably after 8. So, you know, if anything absurd happens, then, and there needs to be a debrief, just text me, but I won't be on the last half hour, unfortunately, which I'm disappointed by, because that's going to be the exciting questions, I imagine, correct?
Well, if it should break into a virtual fist fight, we'll let you know.
Wowza. And I
Um,
did not see Josh Weinstein's email, Dave, but I did see yours.
You know, he's doing to meet the candidates, which is fine. You know, listen, no, we're not exactly unique in that. It just,
Oh, I saw that. Yeah.
it's Josh. He just sometimes always his emails find me at the wrong moment.
No, it's fine. I can't wait to read his piece on social equity next. Okay.
Also, you know what? It's 5:31, but
You know,
still,
at
I just
Yeah,
Princeton,
we should.
you know, the great mediator within me is going to try to bridge this gap. That's all I'll say. I'll leave it there.
All right.
Noted, and thank you.
Let's-
All right, guys, I should let people in. There's 42 people already.
Nice.
Let's do
I
it.
can't get my video working. I've done something, I've screwed something up.
All right, Lizzie, we're going to leave you in the corner to fix that.
That's
Everyone
okay.
ready?
Don't worry about me.
Let him in. Good.
okay by me.
Yeah.
Wait, before you do on committees, I don't know what committees you decided on last week, so I'm just gonna say if people have ideas. You know, I'll just
Yeah,
talk if
I mean,
we're
you know,
interested.
I mean, obviously you can talk about social equity, you can talk about cultivation, you can talk about entrepreneurs and incubators. I mean, those are things we're definitely.
Yeah, homegrown cultivation, finance and banking.
Yeah, by the way, Peter
Finance,
Sue,
banking.
Hold
Peter
on.
Sue was honored to be the banking chair if we want him
Oh,
for.
awesome. All right, we'll follow up. But guys, quick. All right, so go ahead. Home grow, finance,
We got
banking, social equity,
cultivation still with
obviously.
Mike McGuire, right?
Yeah. Social equity.
I have
Banking.
amnesty coming.
Say again.
Banking and finance.
Yep, got it.
Yeah, got that. So amnesty and clemency, which are two different but related things.
Well, I would actually, Dave, don't limit it. We'll talk about one of the outgrowths of social equity is going to be how we integrate legacy market, and that's a topic in that. So let's. But if you want to, we'll say that we're going to focus on amnesty and clemency, like part of it. Or that's part
Those
of your
got to
thing.
work
You're gonna talk about
together. Those got to work together as two different committees because you'll get tripping on yourself. It's too hard to. Not that it's too hard to do. It's two big topics to tackle in one committee.
We're 3 minutes. We're 3 minutes.
Yeah. Let's go, guys. Let's go. All right. So I'll throw those out as examples. We're good. Ready? Good.
Yep.
Here we go.
Hey there.
Hi there.
Good afternoon.
Good to see you, Bruce. Liking the
Good.
flag as always. You're actually, you have to, it should be at 37. There are 13 more to fill in.
Oh, 13. Okay. All right. I'm going to see if I guess I could manipulate it. It's a PDF.
Every
All right,
time a
but
seat
David
comes
is
online, we'll add another leaf.
Okay. I like that. I love that idea. Oh,
All
nice
right.
to see you,
So we're
Andrew.
just, welcome. This is good.
Yeah.
All right, we're getting a lot of people coming in, so I'm just
Yeah.
gonna click the admit button a couple more times, and then we'll let people kind of straggle in. But while we're doing
Hello,
that-
Ruben.
Hey, everyone.
All right, so let's get rolling because we got a lot to talk about, a lot of great things to talk about. First, for those of you who are new to us, welcome. We embrace your presence and hope that you'll take part in the conversation. It's what we do. And by doing that, we come up with some good things. Happy May the 4th for anyone who's geeky like me. So I'll just leave it at that. Inside joke for Star Wars fans, which now makes it an outside joke. My name is Andrew Shriver. I'm president of the Hudson Valley Cannabis Industry Association and a director of the New York City Association. For those of you, again, who are new, our mission, generally speaking, is to be a hub for the industry to help each other grow. We want to formulate critical policy. We want to shape the market and ensure that everybody has a fair opportunity to succeed, which obviously is going to be a front and center issue in what we talk about today. The way that we do our work is, in addition to having these general forums that are open to the public, we do our work through committees. And the advantage of being a member is that you can be on any committee you like. And the committees are where we make policy. If you go to our website, you scroll down a couple of links, you'll see something called a policy prospectus. That's going to show off the amazing work that the members, that all of you have done to advance policy in the state of New York. And I'm proud to say that a lot of what we wrote as policy objectives, including for the legislation, found its way into the legislation. And if you don't believe me, I'll give you a very easy example. Look at our paper on taxation, compare the rate structure that we proposed to what was in the statute, and you'll see that we are either very clairvoyant or somewhat influential. But either way, it's probably good to be hanging with us. And one of the key pieces in that, which was emphasized in the email blast that went out to all of you, which I hope you all had a chance to take a look at, was our social equity piece. And we have authors from that piece with us today. I won't say more about that. We're going to get to that with Dave will tee that up, and then Ruben's going to take over to help moderate that discussion. Very exciting stuff. So please do join us as a member. You can also just subscribe if you want to get to know what we're about a little bit more. Either way, just go to the homepage. You can scroll down to either just put your name in and get emails or to join us as a member. We ask that you tell your friends about it, particularly as this is an extremely exciting time because we are now just a month old in terms of being a legal state, but a state that is legal and both getting the market right. That's still something that's to be determined. Toward that end, we'll continue to have these types of forums. And I do want to put a plug in for the Homegrown and Cultivation presentation that we're going to have on May 25th, where we're going to talk with the authors of that paper. Shout out to, I see Michelle Fields, Mike McGuire is in the crowd. I'm leaving people out. Their names are on the piece, so please go to that. So on May 25th, we're going to have another forum like this. We're going to talk about the issues that they got right and the issues that they still need to get right. And I'll leave it there for now. I'm going to turn it over to Dave Holland, president of the New York City Cannabis Industry Association, who's going to set the stage for today, and then we'll turn it over to Ruben. So thank you all for joining us, and Dave, take it away.
Thanks, Andrew. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited about tonight. So I'm just going to take 2 seconds before I cut to the chase, which is this is a committee that I've been waiting for a long time, and we've worked very hard to form it, and we've had several conversations just building towards tonight. And just to build on what Andrew said, it's all about committee work here. So the CIAs are all about your input, and it's only as much as you give in to the work process. What comes out is really influential, like you said. And to that extent, people have asked about committees coming up, and we do have a finance and banking committee that is taking people on, and we can arrange to have you with them. Mike McGuire is heading up cultivation. Tonight is social equity. I'm putting together an amnesty and clemency committee that's going to look at issues that are relevant to still legacies from the drug war. And those are things that you have additional information or ideas of committees that you like, please feel free to put them into the chat. And please feel free to put your questions into the chat tonight. We'll try to not only get them to Ruben Lindo, who's going to be hosting the conversation this evening, but we'll try to answer them in live time if there's something that we can provide along the way. But as I said, I've been waiting years for this. And so the MRTA came out, in 2013 was the first rendition of it. And it was really driven towards social equity, social justice, and economic redevelopment. And I've always wondered exactly what are the terms people are referring to, because are two people relating to each other in the same way when they throw around the term social equity? Because it's not a term that should be thrown around. It's a term that should really be a building block to so much more. And we saw with refinements over the years that finally in 2021, the MRTA has reigned supreme and it has come true. But I'm not convinced that every person views it the same way. And there are some big questions out there of what is it and who is it and where should it be first implemented and who should be the first to be prioritized. These are critical questions that I am so proud that Andrew and I and the rest of the directors were able to put this committee together. And thankfully to Ruben Lindo, who has really come to be not only a director of the organization, but a leading voice within the committee and within the organizations to help us address these questions. So tonight we really have a stellar panel of people with a variety of views that are so critical that have been lacking, I think, in some of the conversations in Albany. And we'd like to bring them out tonight to our membership to help try to get to a better understanding of the commonalities and the common denominators that are needed to move this whole industry forward. So with that, Ruben, I am very much looking forward to what you all have to say tonight. And in any way that we can help out, we're here with questions and so forth too.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining tonight. As David and Andrew both said, there's nothing more important than the social equity aspect of the cannabis bill. We see that each section of the bill, if you haven't read all 129 pages of the bill, there are mentions of social equity throughout, so that we believe that social equity probably has the biggest impact to shaping this market and this industry in general. We've always believed that social equity was the beginning of two things. One, not only diversity and inclusion, but it also opened the door for us to really take a hard look and have really tough discussions on things like criminal justice reform, things like how do we heal the community after we've gone through a failed war on drugs, and what does this impact look like, and what does it look like in a perfect world? So this will be the first of many of these town hall discussions surrounding social equity. And again, like Andrew said, I encourage you, if you're not a member, to please join if you want to join this group. We've put together probably the most outstanding minds that I've worked with in social equity. And I've worked in 3 different municipalities, 2 states, and also in Canada on this social equity issue. And one of the first and foremost, you're going to hear things tonight very organically. This is going to be a discussion unlike you've heard probably. We're going to do it in a town hall forum. Instead of having panelists just fire away at answers and questions, we're going to have the discussion just like we do once a week when we're in our group, in our committee group. And you're going to hear differences of opinions, but that doesn't mean that we don't respect each other, because I think at the end of the day, what you see in this group is really the foundational structure of what we believe the social equity component, not just in New York, but nationally, should look like. So without further ado, I'll get to the first question, and any one of the panelists can jump in first, and then we'll just continue the conversation like we did and like we normally do. So when we talk about social equity, one of the questions that a lot of people have is, what exactly is social equity? What does social equity actually mean? Let me just step back for a second to hold that thought. So on the panel, we have Colleen Hughes, we have Frederica Easley, we have Kenny Mack, AKA Lando Calrissian III. I like that. We have Michelle Fields. We have Candace. I don't see Candace on here, but she's here. Candace, give a wave. We have Martha McDermott, who's a board member who sits in on this. Liz Shields, who sits in on this committee. And I don't think I'm missing Christine De La Rosa, and she'll join us when she can.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are.
Ruben, it's Candace Notice. I'm here as well.
All right. Hey, Candace.
Hey.
And we also have Joe Devlin. Joe, are you here? Joe Devlin hasn't joined us yet. So let me just get into the first question. So those are the panelists for tonight's discussion. So when we talk about social equity, one of the questions that comes up is, what exactly is social equity? So I'm going to turn it over to the first panelists, and I'll call on the first panelist and then everyone just chime in thereafter. So Colleen, why don't you go ahead and start? What is your view of what social equity is, and explain social equity to the group in your view?
Thanks, Ruben. Hello, everyone. Thanks for everyone for joining us. I really respect everyone that's on this panel and this group and this organization a lot. So I just want to say that. Thank you for having me. A lot of the conversations that we've had as a group and a committee about equity is not giving everyone the same resources and calling that equity. It's really equality. Equity is providing foundational resources for folks proportionate to their needs. And I think that when we talk about disproportionately impacted communities, they need disproportionate advantages to systemic issues like licensure in a big industry such as cannabis. So I'd like to lead off with saying that, and I know I always tend to be the contrarian in the group, and I like to talk about what social equity isn't. Social equity isn't using your white wife to sign the piece of paper for you to get 51% of a license. And that's happening a lot. I've had a lot of conversations with people interested in approaching the industry and thinking they could just slide their wife in on the application and qualify for social equity licenses. And I say, I'm not going to be able to work with you if that's what you want to do. So I think it's important to have the conversation of what it is and what it isn't.
Great, thank you. Michelle, what from your standpoint, Michelle Field?
Hi, everyone that's joining us today. I'm going to be very quick because I have a hard stop at 6:10. But for me, I look back at social equity with the legislator intent of the legislators from inception. And their intent is very important when it came to the MRTA, to make it diverse, to make it inclusive, to understand that we're dealing in New York State, New York City, that we're dealing with diverse, very unique populations, and to really understand what the war on drugs have done to impact the communities, such as Brownsville, East New York, South Jamaica, South Bronx, and how those persistent issues continue as we legalize. So when we talk about social equity, we have to start talking about social equity from its inception and making sure that it's accessible, that it is inclusive, that it can address the needs of those unique communities, those impacted communities, not only in the 5 boroughs, but in New York State. And when we talk about inclusion, we talk about how do we increase ownership? How do we make it affordable? How do we lower those barriers of entry or have no barriers of entries? How do we address those collateral harms to our immigrant population? How do we address our parolees and our probationers? How do we address our Black and Latino moms who still face, negligent charges in family court? How do we address those issues of our felons? And now with this MRTA, we have the felony hiring. So to me, when we talk about social equity from inception, from the bill to the regs, when we talk about social equity, we cannot go without talking about sustainability. We cannot go without talking about our legacy market from legacy to legal, providing that amnesty. And then when we talk about, impacted communities and how they're included in social equity, those impacted communities, that historical data, that understanding of those persistent issues in those impacted communities. So as an attorney, as someone that is of the community, someone that's passionate, that's committed, not only to social equity, but the business of cannabis, I think it's very important that social equity has to flow from the legislation to the regulations to the standards. And I just wanted to share that perspective.
Thank you. Kenny?
To me, equity means ownership, and social equity means ownership not driven by profit margin. And justice means justice, and social justice means justice not driven by continuation of prohibition or over-policing communities.
Awesome. Christine De La Rosa.
Of course, I was talking while I was on mute, so, you know. For me, social equity means so many different things to so many different people. And it's all about, repairing harm and making sure that we're creating a fair and equitable cannabis company. So one of the things that me and my team have really been thinking about, because there's plenty of advocates and activists way smarter than I am that are doing that work around social equity as it is as attached to ownership and workforce development, all that other stuff. But my company comes from the legacy market, and one of the things that we've really started to see in all of the states previous to New York is that there's actually no way to transition out of the legacy market. Or it's very hard to transition out of the legacy market. There's a lot of fear, and what will happen to them if they come out and say they're from the legacy market? What happens to their companies that they currently run? And what we know is that by 2025, they're expecting $29 billion in sales nationally, but they're also predicting about $58 billion in the informal market, or what we call the legacy market. So what my team's really been thinking about in terms of social equity is that there was a whole marketplace, an entire industry that started in this legacy market. And we wouldn't be here without the folks that started in the legacy market. And we can see that they're very well entrenched because they have been here providing medicine and services to their communities for a very, very long time. And so for me, what social equity means, alongside everything Michelle said, everything Kenny says, everything Colleen said, was we need to start with New York and then retrofit some type of amnesty provision to create equity for the legacy operators. And that talks about things like being able to use their available funds without the need to verify a source, the ability to sell their existing product and put it into whatever the seed to sale is going to be, as long as it gets texted. No assessment and charges of back taxes, education and implementation business assistance so that they can comply with the compliance measures as well as workforce development. And I could go on and on. But what you're seeing here as you listen to every person talk about what they believe social equity is, you can see that it is a framework that's vast and wide and available to us. We can actually do this. And so that is what I'm thinking about right now, especially in the New York market, as I know many legacy operators there. How do we help them transition to the legal market? How do we help them and their teams, because they're teams of people, right? We all had teams into the formal market. So to me, that is part of what social equity would be, is to make sure that we include everybody, not just some people.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So Candace brings a very unique perspective, and one that we hadn't discussed previous to Candace joining us last week for her first meeting. And she kind of lit a fire under me and my thinking from a new direction of what an equitable market looks like. And I'm writing a piece on that, and that'll be out hopefully in the next couple days here. But it's really kept me up at night. So Candace, please jump in. Without further ado, I think that what you're going to mention is really going to open people's eyes.
Well, I hope I can recall what you're referencing, Ruben, but thank you for that introduction. And it's fresh in my mind. I just had a plea pre-planning meeting because I'm speaking on a panel about the Safe Banking Act for the Just Economy Conference. That was the conference that Jay Powell and Elizabeth Warren just spoke at last week, and there was a lot of coverage for Jay Powell. So I do not disagree with anything that the panelists said. It is my observation that they're addressing the broad base of the pyramid, they're addressing today, and they're addressing the legacy market. As a 20-year banker and bank regulator veteran, I see this when I think about social equity. This is kind of a derivative of a reparation wherein we, the cannabis law in New York State was framed in the context of providing an advantage to communities that were unfairly or disproportionately disadvantaged by illegal cannabis. So in my mind, I say grants, financing, funding for licenses, zero interest or no, or loans or subsidized loans. This is an opportunity for minority-owned banking to provide, not only establish more minority-owned banks, but also to have those minority-owned banks provide the services for the cannabis industry. This is like a John D. Rockefeller, JP Morgan, Dale Carnegie moment, in my opinion, because I think that we have to seize opportunities up and down the capital structure, and this is the new frontier to do that. So in my, from my perspective, there can be a duality of those goals being accomplished, such as tax credits for hiring veterans, disabled veterans, people transitioning from prisons out into the society, and having an organization or several organizations where a farmer like myself can say, hey, I need to tap into prisoners returning back into the workforce, or veterans or disabled veterans. What type of training do they have? What type of assimilation or inculcation routines have they gone through, such that I can just go ahead and find a resource and hire them? So I think that there really needs to be a strong emphasis on the entire pyramid and the entire opportunity, and like I said, attachment points up and down the capital structure, especially as it relates to banking and providing, quite frankly, quite plainly, financial advantage to those communities that have been disproportionately affected by cannabis. And we talked a little bit at our meeting about getting first in lines for licensures for that group of people. The 50% can't just get 50% of the crumbs, they've got to get 50% of the cream. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Frederica.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you for being here. So I will not repeat what everyone has said. I think amazing points have been given. I think the one thing that I would just offer is that equity is not a handout. And we see that, you know, luckily in New York, there was, as Michelle mentioned, intention around this legislation. It was the key difference between the MRTA and the CRTA. It was the intent, right? The intent to honestly acknowledge and put words to paper and hopefully to action, theory to practice, of how are we actually going to repair this harm. But this is something that communities, primarily with Black and Brown individuals inhabiting them, have paid the price for already, right? And so what we have to first and foremost have the energy of is that you are not doing social equity applicants a favor. This is something that is owed to them. They are people who are still paying with their lives, you know, for nonviolent crimes, who are in jail. And now you have people who don't look like them making money and being able to operate in the legal space with this plan. And so I think that that's one thing. I think also it is the acknowledgement, and it may be uncomfortable for some, but the acknowledgement of exactly what that harm did in terms of institutional and systemic racism that span from that. And so when we're talking about having a leg up, when we're talking about needing these advantages, being able to enter into the adult use space without having to compete against MSOs and all of these large organizations, corporations that have, you know, teams behind them. Again, this is not this is not a handout, right? Like this is what they are owed. Like social equity applicants are owed the opportunity to enter into the space and be able to get their footing, be able to set up a foundation for generational wealth that not only helps individuals, but also helps their communities. And so I'll end there, Ruben.
Thank you. And to reiterate, go ahead, Michelle.
Back on, and it was beautiful as Frika spelled out, but, and again, it's not a handout. And we want to compete, but we have to have the ability to compete by capitalizing those licenses. It's one thing to apply to get approved, but can you capitalize that license? And that's very important. So access to banking is going to be very important. You know, reducing the cost of doing business in this industry is another. And how do you provide de-verticalization, and how do you make it incentivized for the legacy market to come into the legal market? You have to reduce the cost of doing business. And for our social equity applicants, it has to be, you know, capitalization of those lives. It's one thing to give grants, you know, 0% loans, but can you capitalize? Can you capitalize that license for the next 3 years? And can you make it profitable? Can you scale? Can you, you know, sustain that business without attracting those predatory, partnerships? So that's one. And number two, when we talk about social equity, you want to talk about, it has to be inclusive, especially in the 5 boroughs when we're so populous, because that 500 feet plan, it's not going to work in, you know, the 5 boroughs when we're talking about 500 feet away from, you know, a school, or a, 200 feet away from a house of worship. Is, you know, Brownsville, East New York, South Jamaica, we have, you know, house of worship and schools almost, you know, on every block. So that's going to be problematic. And then we have to talk about the sustainability, the environmental issues, especially when it comes to, you know, the South Bronx and our outer boroughs dealing with, you know, environmental justice. Then we have to really protect the most vulnerable class, and that is our immigrant population, especially when it comes to DUIs, especially when it comes to, you know, deportation, Nyccia and HUD exclusion and eviction from housing because of their use. So I wanted to share that perspective as well.
And Ruben,
Thank you.
Ruben, if I may, and I will let you.
No, go.
Forward. But you know, piggybacking on what everyone said, I think that language in social equity is so important. The term or the phrase social equity, social economic equity applicants, has become like a buzz phrase, right? And so we see a lot of states saying and speaking to social equity applicants, and there being like maybe a sentence, maybe one paragraph mentioned in their legislation, but with no real meat, no real teeth. And so I want to put forth that like language matters. And so if we are going to speak about social equity, then we have to make sure that there is some meat to it, that you can't just use social equity as a buzz phrase to move your agenda along, but not really have real intent on helping those individuals, right? And giving those individuals the support and the wraparound services that they need to be able to succeed and sustain in this business. And to that degree, I'm happy, Michelle, that you specifically said amnesty and not clemency, because I've been hearing clemency in a lot of different conversations. And again, on the strength of words matter, amnesty and clemency are not the same thing, right? Clemency is leniency, okay? Right. Clemency is having compassion, right? Having some wiggle room, if you will, right? Some reversal, but that's not a clear slate. What we want specifically is amnesty. That's exactly what we want. We want it to be forgotten. We want people to be released. We want records to be cleared. And we want those who have been impacted to have a fresh start and ability to enter into this industry.
Thank you so much. Great points on that first question. And you guys who know me, who spend intimate time with me on these calls, I'm going to say one of the things that I didn't hear any of us talking about, we're talking about social equity. We keep talking about economic barrier to entry. We're talking about bringing in the legacy market. But one of the key things that I believe social equity is missing is the discussion around mental health and health equity, right? Because we know that the war on drugs created a whole class of people that suffer from various mental health issues from the systemic racism. We see it in society today. If we learned anything from the summer of 2020, is that people are fed up, right? And people have gotten to a point where we've forgotten to talk about those things like the protected class or the most vulnerable class. And we're talking about creating a group of protected citizens that are given and afforded opportunities, but we're not talking about social equity along the lines of health equity, right? Again, 2020 showed us that this pandemic, in the beginning, I made jokes and said the pandemic was discriminatory and it only attacked white men between the ages of such and such, such and such. The first several months, that's all we heard about. And then look at what it did in the Black and brown community. It ravaged the Black and brown community. So when we talk about social equity, I want us to also keep in mind when we're talking about meat and substance and not just, the milk of the subject, but the real substance of the subject is also to discuss what health equity is. So that's just my take. The next part of this discussion, so much about the community reinvestment piece. And I know this was a hot topic in our group. We kind of went round and round. I think we spent 3 meetings on this community reinvestment piece. And I think that this is super important for people to understand what we're talking about and what we mean when we discuss the community reinvestment part, because they put a huge emphasis on taking the dollars from the marketplace and putting it into community reinvestment. And I'm going to open this up to any panelist who wants to go first. Is this the right way to go? Are we talking about taking this money and dumping it into disproportionately affected communities? And when we look at disproportionately affected communities, we cannot forget about the upstate, past Hudson Valley, past Westchester County. We have to look at the places like Amsterdam, New York, Jamestown, New York, Hudson, New York, Greene County, right? Chautauqua County. We have to look at those. Even Buffalo, right? So when we get outside of Buffalo and we look at those townships, we're talking about places that were severely impacted by the war on drugs. So what is community reinvestment? What does that look like? And what does that sound like from us from that discussion? I'm open up to whoever wants to go first on the panel, please.
I'm going to go quickly because I have a Bronx Community Board 2 meeting. For me, when we're talking about, it's not a reinvestment, it's an investment, because those substantive issues are still persistent in our community. We are still dealing with the war on drugs. And it's not only just cannabis, we're talking about, crack. We're still dealing with the remnants of crack and dope in our communities. That's why we have so many methadone programs that have not been effective. That's number one. When we talk about reinvestment, we have to understand the needs of each community. And it's not going to be a one-off, because what works, what is needed in the South Bronx is not necessarily needed in Buffalo. What is needed in Buffalo is not necessarily needed in East New York. So we have to really, talk to those experts in those impacted communities. What are your needs? What are those persistent issues? And I'm going to tell you right now, underfunded schools, our food deserts, the digital, barriers that they're still facing, especially in the South Bronx, the high asthma and lead rates in all of the boroughs when it comes to impacted communities. Let's sit down with those experts. And I think those experts from the impacted communities are going to be your guide. And those are the ones that should decide how the money should be invested back into those impacted communities.
Thank you, Michelle. Go ahead, Colleen.
So I think, thanks, Michelle. We're going to miss you for the rest of the panel. Community reinvestment is kind of what I focused most of the nonprofit work that I've been creating here on cannabis reform. So exactly to Michelle's point about local resources and the local needs and knowledge of local communities, I created a nonprofit program that's going to address these issues at the county level. So we're tapping into the local resources in each county. And New York is positioned to lead the way in this, where we're starting out, we're using cannabis as the gateway industry to reinvest in communities most harmed and to shorten the wealth gap instead of broadening the wealth gap. And so we work with the local nonprofits in each community to identify what those needs are. We work with the corporate MSOs that are locating their cannabis businesses in each locality. And we can't really rely on the government and the regulators to do this the right way for the people. And we can't rely on the corporations who are doing performative social equity programming in cannabis just so they can check a box. So we're working on really continuing this conversation at the community level and making sure that this community development organization exists everywhere that there's a cannabis company trying to locate, so that we can track the data and the success of these programs, where we're monitoring literacy rates, we're monitoring school attendance, we're monitoring the amount of small businesses that are opening up in these locations, whether they're cannabis centric or not. So with regard to reinvestment, I think the MRTA really sets us up for success if we have equity-minded folks in the Office of Cannabis Management, the Chief Equity Officer and the Executive Director, instead of someone who's a serial regulator and who is operating out of a place of fear and not out of education, where they're going to continue to perpetuate these cycles and keep the barriers very high. Where we're going to use the community reinvestment grant funds through our program to dispense them locally in the most effective way for that particular community. So these are, we have an opportunity in New York to lead the charge and set the example for the rest of the country, like Christine said, to retrofit all of the other failed social equity policies in the rest of the country. If we can locate at the county level, we can tap into those already existing successful nonprofits, provide more resources for those communities, and then provide data back to the government on a biannual basis to track and say, these are how these programs are working and how do we adjust accordingly. And that those decisions are made at the county level, sort of like as a local committee, to ensure that this reinvestment is productive. And it goes beyond cannabis. Cannabis companies can join in and provide resources. We can use matching funds, and it doesn't have to be just cannabis. It can be any other small business, large company from other industries to provide on-the-job training, workforce placement, career path development, and all of these resources. So we're really working hard to insert ourselves in between the regulators and the community to allow for this like holistic kind of program to take place so we can do actual practical reinvestment.
Ruben, I would just like to contribute my perspective. I like what my fellow panelists have said. Because I've been in regulation and I know how things are supposed to happen and they grossly fall short of that, and it doesn't get exposed, remediated, et cetera, until the damage has already been done. I think that there should be very clear definitions and litmus tests for for community reinvestment, especially for the big corporations, data tracking, reporting. I like what Colleen was indicating about people, even if you don't want to go into a cannabis business, the money should be used to rehabilitate an entire community in a multifaceted fashion with the tax revenues, et cetera. So I hope that responsibility will be set up and established from the beginning, and there will be accountability on the part of the cannabis office, but moreover penalties for these big corporations who do not comply, who fall short of their obligations, in some way that we can refunnel and cycle that revenue money programs back into the community, because it's vitally important that, we don't waste an opportunity. By we, I mean New York State, to lift all boats with the revenues that are coming off of this burgeoning new industry, to make sure that we help to rebuild communities holistically with the funds.
Great point.
So Ruben,
And Ruben,
was
Go.
that you, Christine?
it was, but you can go ahead. Oh, okay.
So just 2 quick points, I would say. One, to Candace's point, in terms of being clear and having parameters, the first thing I think about is making sure that the communities are clear, that we know exactly which communities we're talking about. And I say that because due to gentrification, due to displacement, a lot of those communities that were originally ravaged, have been ravaged for 10, 15, 20 years, may have a different makeup at this point. I'm originally from Buffalo, New York, and I know there's an area known as the Fruit Belt. When I was growing up, that was totally taken over, totally disinvested intentionally to drive property values and things of that nature down. And now in its current day is the medical corridor. And so those individuals who occupy that community do not look like the people who lived through and were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. That's the first thing I would say. We need to be very clear. I think that also speaks to the point that Colleen and Michelle were making in terms of actually having conversations. Like, this is not something that should be dictated. This is something that should be partnered on so that we can make sure that those individuals and communities as a whole that have been impacted actually receive these funds. And then the second thing I would say, and it's just really kind of funny to me when we talk about the investment piece, because during the war on drugs, like since, what was it, 1971, 72, the government found money to fund this. They found money to put extra funds into police departments and to have special units that were specifically patrolling, these urban areas, these urban communities. And now what we're talking about is us, right? Like, the people essentially repairing our harm. We are talking about, the money, the revenue, tax revenue from us finally being able to enjoy cannabis legally, using our money, using that money to repair the harm that they did to our community with the policies that they created and allowed for disproportionate enforcement of them. And so when we're talking about this investment, like, no one, and we've talked about it in our committee, but no one is really talking about, like, where's if there is no longer a war on drugs, right? And we know that a lot of the war on drugs primarily targeted cannabis, right? So if that is no longer an issue, where is the funding that was pumped into police departments and these special task units to lock people who look like me up? Where is that money? And why is that money not also being matched with tax revenue to be invested into these communities that have been for decades disproportionately harmed by the enforcement of policies due to the war on?
Good point. Hold on one second, Kenny. Christine was going to go, and then Frederica went in. Go ahead, Christine. Kenny, I'll get to you next.
All I was going to say was that when we're talking about social equity, we're talking a lot about the communities that were harmed, and that's absolutely should be our number one priority. But the secondary thing I think we should be talking about in terms of social equity is that let's say we get 50, 75% of what we would like to see happen in social equity. What's next, right? What happens after that? And the reason I say that is because as an operator, a current legal operator in the industry, there are a lot of places where you could get a license and you could not actually realize the potential of that license. And I'm going to give just one quick example, because we always talk about the MSOs, and of course we talk about all those things, but there's all these other companies that are ancillary companies that also contribute to the industry. So there's a company who does a lot of data analytics, and they charge a lot of money, like $25,000 to $35,000 a month, to get the analytics and what's being sold in every legal state. And if you're a small business, like really what the social equity licenses target are smaller businesses, you can't afford to have that data. I don't have $35,000 a month to get the data that is being used by the MSOs to decide how to purchase their product, where to purchase their product, what, the top strains are, like, to be competitive with the large companies. And I think one of the things that we maybe don't need to focus on in this call, but I wanted to put on everybody on this call's radar, is it's not only about leveling the playing field with regards to getting the licensing, but it's also about doing that after you get a license. So just wanted to point that out.
Nope, great point. Great point. That's one of the things that we're going to cover in future conversations, is how to really start shaping the language to include not just MSOs and small business operators, but how do we affect and really affect change in the ancillary businesses who profit so much off of what we do every day, i.e. for company, i.e. All of those, because all of that stuff, if we draw it back to revenue generating and disproportionate access to funds and all of the things that we always talk about, we have to really rope in and rein in and get under control those ancillary businesses, because those in fact will create more barriers of entry and keep us, keep the minority business owner at bay by having exorbitant pricing, even from consultants, right? Consultants on the outside looking to charge and really be predatory to those who we consider social equity applicants. So I've captured that, and we're going to bring that up in our forum group for the next meeting. Kenny, go ahead.
The only point I was going to make is that there's the issue of tax revenue, right? And then there's the issue of the state budget. One of the things that we, the people of the state of New York, have told our law enforcement community by changing the law is, we no longer need you to enforce cannabis prohibition. And that's not small. And the reason why that's not small is because of the percentage of the work that law enforcement officers do on a day-to-day basis that's related to the enforcement of the prohibition against the simple possession of cannabis. When you look at arrest statistics, if you combine the total of all violent crime arrests, it's mathematically a smaller number than the combined total of all arrests for the simple possession of cannabis, which is an indication that our law enforcement agencies are spending the overwhelming majority of their time doing work that we, the people of the state of New York, have told them they don't need to do anymore.
Right.
We don't need you to do that anymore. And so, for me, rather than focusing on the eventual production of what might be $250 million in tax revenue some years down the road, I think it also makes sense to take a look at currently allocated law enforcement budgets, because the second number pales in comparison, the first number pales in comparison to the second number. And I'll just throw out the New York Police Department. The New York Police Department has an operating budget of $100 million a week. $100 million a week, every single week. And mathematically speaking, they spend the majority of their time enforcing the prohibition against the simple possession of cannabis, which is no longer a thing. So at some point, doesn't it make sense, instead of waiting to start restoring communities and reinvesting in communities with tax revenue that may or may not be generated down the road. If that need exists today, and there's no longer a prohibition against the simple possession of cannabis, and that's what our law enforcement officers and agencies have been spending the overwhelming majority of their time doing, why shouldn't we attach their already allocated law enforcement budgets for the purpose of restoring and reinvesting in these communities?
That's a great point, Kenny, and we've really hammered on that, and that's another one when we start talking about really shaping the language in the future forums. So let me answer one of the questions that was in the chat that I just quickly glanced at. Someone asked, what is the future direction of this group? So what we're hoping to do is have these discussions so that we can formulate a policy paper that we can send to the legislators, or we're really beyond legislators now. I've pointed this out a couple times on our board meeting and in our internal meeting here of this group. And I said, we're beyond legislators now. Now we have to get to the regulators, right? Because they're the ones who are going to shape this industry. The legislators just propose it and make it a law. The industry is formed by those who create the regs in which we have to operate in, right? And I think that in other jurisdictions, this is where social equity has failed. Because we were so happy with having the language there, we were short-sighted in getting into the minutia of the details to shape the regulations that really shape and structure what this industry looks like. But I want to throw a question out there to the panelists that's really been a hot topic, and we talked about it last week, and I want to spend about 4 or 5 minutes on it. I don't want to limit us to time, but I want to get to the questions and answers of the panelists. We discussed the inclusion of the LGBTQ community, and do they fall under social equity as the bill is written? And we know that there was no specific language there, but do we believe, or I want to hear from the panelists, what are your thoughts on that community being included in the discussion of social equity? And one of the things that comes to mind for me, where I struggle, is because whenever I think of social equity, I'm always thinking of those who are disproportionately affected by the war on drugs, i.e. Black and brown folks. And I understand that in that community, there were also targets, and there are Black and brown folks in that community. So as we shape this, I want us to really have that conversation, because we wouldn't be doing justice if we were talking social equity and we excluded someone or a group of people or a class of people that were really harmed by the war on drugs, just basically on oversight. And again, like Frederica says, and I love so eloquently, words matter, right? And our words definitely ring bells on the second floor. So I'm going to throw that out. Is the LGBTQ community part of social equity? And if so, how do we include them? Go.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and field this one, if that's okay. My company is over 75% LGBTQ owned and over 95% people of color owned. And that includes all of our investors. So I do think that the LGBTQ community was definitely impacted, and definitely impacted specifically during the AIDS crisis, right? That is how we got to legal medical marijuana in California, was through the advocacy of the LGBTQ community to make medical marijuana legal for the people that were dying. And they were dying in hundreds of thousands of people because they weren't getting the care that they needed at the hospitals or through the doctors because they were specifically LGBTQ. However, this is the same, or not the same, it's not proportionally the same, but this also happens to Black people. This also happens to Latinx people, meaning that we go to doctors and we're not, I went to a doctor. I was held sick for 5 years by doctors because they didn't know how to treat people of color. And so it's so hard to say, whether or not and who is included, I think that there's intersectionality in that, right? There's an intersectionality in all of these groups that were harmed at different levels and different stages and at different times. And so what I would say to that was that for me, my company has that intersectionality because a lot of the people of color, both Black and POC and Latin and Indigenous that are part of our country, part of our company, have been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. And they also are LGBTQ. And I think that it's hard to make a distinction. We have to lead with our hearts and say what communities were mostly disproportionately targeted. And in some cases for cannabis and for drugs, we can really look to the Black community, even over the Latinx people. They were more targeted than any other community. And so I want to be sure as a CEO of my company that I always keep in mind that just because one of my groups was targeted, we may not have been the most harmed. And sometimes that's hard to say because people are like, well, you know, I was harmed. You don't know what my harm is. And they're right. I don't know what their harm is. But from a statistical perspective, everything that I do personally and everything that's the pillars of our company, how we create our social justice framework, is how Black people are disproportionately infected, even though I am not a Black person. Because as we all know, or hopefully we all know, I can't say we all know, when we make life better for the people that were most harmed in anything, whether it's medicine or cannabis or, you know, ability to get real estate, when we're able to make sure that that Black people, the most disproportionately harmed people, have it better, everybody else has it better too, because they're the ones that are the most harmed. And so that's just my perspective. And I'm sure there'll be people that disagree with me, but that's how my social equity lens and my social justice lens always points to that. Those are the people that we need to uplift and do wraparound services and do these talks about, because if it gets better for the Black community, it literally gets better for all of the other communities that were maybe less disproportionately harmed, but harmed nonetheless.
Thank you, Christine. I want to hear from someone else on the panel. I mean, we really went deep on this 2 weeks ago, and I want to hear from someone else in the group. I've dedicated 5 more minutes to this topic because it was such a hot topic in the chat.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Even though I'm not part of the panel.
Absolutely.
Hey there. So for me, this is a really critical point, is making sure that the LGBTQ community is represented. No one is going to argue against the fact that communities of color are by far the top of the list. But as far as how the current legislation reads, it's definitely a missed point that LGBTQ wouldn't be included above, and I'm sorry, women, distressed farmers, or service disabled vets. Currently, right now, in committee for the state, they're working to try to amend what New York City did already a couple of years ago when it comes to government contracts, separate issue, but making sure that those include LGBTQ, veterans, and disabled people, not just specifically service disabled veterans. So both of those are already being set with a precedent. When we're talking about the communities that have been unjustly affected by the war on drugs, close second after, again, communities of color has to be considered the LGBT community. The fact of the persecution that happened during the HIV/AIDS crisis that I happen to be a part of and have lost many friends to also, when you're looking at this bill, defining it as its equality and equity within the industry as a whole. As a gay man that has worked in the industry for over a decade across 7 different states, I can say honestly, gay dudes are probably one of the largestly disrespected group out of all of our other minority groups. A deeper dive into that goes into the fact that in communities of color, oftentimes as high as 60% of LGBT persons that are people of color often commit suicide. That's disgusting and upsetting. And a lot of that has to do with the fact of not being a part of this conversation. So I just think it's really important for us to be involved with that.
No, thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say thank you for speaking up. I would like to be educated more on that. I know some things, but I don't know all things. I do know that African-American trans people are definitely targeted by the police. LGBTQ people are harassed and targeted by the police. And I would love to find out more about the nexus between being targeted because you are a member of that community in connection with cannabis. Someone mentioned earlier about the AIDS epidemic and the AIDS crisis. And, I think how much more would those people's sufferings have been eased if they did have access to medical marijuana and cannabis. And, it could just be the simple fact that it was too slow and too late. And I know from just education, not actually being there and have personal experience, that people with AIDS and HIV, when they did go into hospitals, treated horribly. My uncle died of AIDS. So I think there definitely needs to be more education, more awareness for that intersection between cannabis being targeted because you are LGBTQ, and how the people were impacted, because I would like to know more personally.
Ruben, if I can, I just want to say, thank you so much for your vulnerability and sharing your perspective on the call tonight. I agree with Candace in terms of being better educated myself, and I think Christine said her remarks were really beautiful. The thing I would say, and Ruben, you started getting into this before this question, but I think it ties in, is, we are beyond legislators at this point. And so now our focus has to be on the rules and regs, right? And so I think that's why it's so important for our rules and regulation, for that process to be a transparent process, and for there to be opportunities for community comment, right? Because I think that what we see here is like no one is perfect, right? There's no such thing as that. And there is intersectionality. And so I, T. Ferris, can't speak to your personal experience, right? Or those experiences from your friends and those within your community. And so we have to make sure that this process offers or allows opportunity to not, have a I gotcha moment, or, point the finger and blame, but just to recognize that these regulators are people as well, and they are also imperfect, as we all are. They are flawed, and so they may not get everything right. They may not get it right? And so, depending on their personal experience, depending on where they will be pulling their motivation from, there are going to be things that do not show up. And so we, as the community, we as those who are advocating for this, we need to make sure that like our voice is heard, your voice is heard in this process.
Thank you so much for first of all, that topic is near and dear to my heart. Not only do I have family members who are gay, and really my brother, we don't call him stepbrothers, my brother was the curator of the Stonewall for the New York City Library, Jason Montilla Bauman. And I'm going to invite him. He has a total different perspective. So when we have these conversations, I'd like for time to jump in, if we could, in a small group setting where we can really hear these and address these issues in the committee. So thank you for opening our eyes time on that, and again, exposing your vulnerability. But what a great segue. I said I don't want this to be like a goddamn Jack Parr talk show. So, and no way did this turn out in that manner. This was probably more amazing than what I thought. But Frederica brought something up. It's important for us to hear from you guys. It's important for us to hear from not just the committee, and the panelists. I want to hear some of the conversation and questions that this audience has, this group has, for either panelists, board members. I think we're well represented on the board. Most of us are here, or just anyone else. Just feel free to chime in. I think that this is where we differ from everyone else, because we take everyone's collective viewpoints and opinions and we try to address them, and we write meaningful pieces. So when you talk about what does the CIA do, what do we do, and how do we do it? I can tell you firsthand, I've spoken to legislators through the entire process, and it was in respect to what the CIA has said. And the biggest piece was that tax piece, as others have alluded to it. And that's what drew me in. But I want to open it up. So are there any questions? Kenny, go ahead.
The one thing that I just wanted to point out about the inclusion of people from the LGBTQ community is earlier, I guess it was a couple of months ago, on a continuing legal education that Axel and Norm from the governor's office did for the New York State Bar Association. They talked about a need to, quote unquote, define the pool when it came to priority applicants. And the implication was, or the assumption was, that they weren't going to get it right. And I don't remember the exact phrase. This is probably more of a David Holland thing. In the bill, where after 2 years, there's supposed to be a review of, I think it's the market composition review or something like that. But after 2 years, there's supposed to be a review of the composition of the market in the state of New York. And so that piece about defining the pool, if it's determined, if our friends from the LGBTQ community find that the pool hasn't been defined broadly enough to be inclusive, then that's certainly a thing that we could, that the association could point out to legislators or regulators to be aware of going in, maybe that the pool has been too narrowly defined.
Thank you. So are there any questions from the group that anyone has, anyone out in this virtual audience? Are there questions that you have maybe for specific panelists, myself, or anyone in the group?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So thanks everybody for sharing tonight, by the way. It's been very interesting to listen. I always appreciate the content that you guys have. It's very helpful to me. I'm a CPA. I'm actually in Rochester, New York. But I'm a member of the Hudson, well, I don't know if I'm a member anymore, but member of Hudson Valley because of our involvement with some of the businesses across New York State. And that's why I'm here today. My question for the panelists is, what are the ways that I can be most helpful as a CPA in the profession, serving the cannabis community, as well as serving ancillary service providers in helping to make the industry operate in the way that it's intended. I have some ideas about that already, but I'd like to hear some alternative perspectives.
Anyone from the panel?
I would say definitely horn in on 280E and really, understand apportionment, because your clients are going to come in and they want to understand 280E, those deductions, those apportionments, understanding that aspect of it is going to be very important. And as you deal with the ancillary, how do you develop a investable, business model that's going to have a well-funded compliance program? So, your expertise is going to be very valuable, but I would suggest that you really horn in on the 280E, the apportionment aspect, the section dealing with the 400s, what are those exclusions and what are those exemptions?
I would say that this is your window as a service provider in the field of compliance. People from the legacy space making the transition over to becoming licensed business operators are going to need help with compliance, 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 and more compliance. Because one thing that I can tell you from 30 years of experience is people in the legacy space are not big on compliance. If they were, there wouldn't be a regulated industry to speak of in the first place. And so one of the things that we always talk about when talking with legacy market providers, well, prior to the law being changed, was that there's a strategy that we describe as 11:59, 12:01, 9 a.m. 11:59 is the work that you have to do as a legacy provider in advance of legalization, in preparation for legalization. 12:01 is after the law has been changed, but you're not ready to do business yet, getting yourself ready to be in position to have a fair market valuation for your business and an idea of how to operate it in a compliant way, so that at 9 a.m., if you get a license or if you're ready to partner with a license holder, you're ready to go ahead and do business. So we're right now in that 12:01 to 9 a.m. period, where people in the legacy space will certainly be able to benefit from being able to talk to people like yourself, financial service providers who can help them with compliance, provided, of course, that you're ready, willing, and able to have those conversations. I would certainly be happy to connect you with legacy market providers who I know could use your help. And you can always get me. It's easy. It's either info@makecannabiswork.org or kmac@makecannabiswork.org. I'm sorry, Lando Calrissian is not in any of my email addresses.
Thank you, Kenny. That was a great question, Morgan. So as someone who transitioned from the legacy market into the traditional regulated market in California, one of the things that I kept saying from perspective was telling my partners, up in Humboldt, we do business a different way. We do things a very different way than what corporate cannabis looks like. And I preach this to anyone coming out of the legacy market. The only area that they can attack you now is through over enforcement, through compliance, right? That's the only area in which you're vulnerable as a legacy operator transitioning. For instance, we didn't understand tax code because none of us were accountants. I was a business guy and I just played the business front role, right? And I handled a lot of distribution stuff on, across the country, right, with my partners. And this year we opened up our first distribution warehouse and we were fined in the tune of almost $200,000 for not being in compliance. Well, why? Because what we do in the field is very different than what the regulators set forth, and most people aren't used to that. So if there was anything from a financial service provider, I would agree with Kenny, is the most important thing is to make sure that your clients understand the area of enforcement comes through compliance. Those were the biggest fines. Those are the vulnerabilities to jail time. And those are your biggest loss of revenue is non-compliance, right? From operational, from seed to sale, it's non-compliance. There was another question out there. Liz, do you want to ask your question? Liz Shields?
I'm trying. Am I unmuted now?
You're there.
Okay, sorry about that. No, I was going to ask a question. I think we've been reading over, when I was sort of looking at the medical section last week on our last panel, there was something about underserved and unserved communities being, the two part of the new dispensaries for the medical ROs were going to have to be in underserved and unserved geographic locations. And my question was, it was very sort of vague, but my question was sort of, is there a way to, instead focus that maybe on a community reinvestment and on a different, on a community that might be more, benefit from an investment in it, like a community that, was disparaged and disproportionately affected. Is there a way to, and that was just something that was so weird and vague. I thought maybe I don't know if we had a comment on that about, if we could maybe help drive it towards a community that we think could deserve it better.
So Liz, that's a great point. This week, I had the fortune of meeting with the mayor of Coxsackie, Mark Evans. Coxsackie, New York is in Greene County. Greene County happens to be one of the poorest counties outside of, I think, Bronx County in the state of New York. And it's funny because they have 2 major prisons there, right? And that's the only industry they have. And one of the things that Mark was saying is, how do I build a cannabis program here? How do we bring the marketplace here so I can participate in this, 3% of the taxable revenue coming to my municipality as the mayor? And I said, Mark, there's a lot of factors to look at, but perhaps you can start by really ushering in companies that want to participate in a fair and socially equitable marketplace and small market minded folks. And let's not exclude, your farmers, right? And those were just the conversations that we had. And then I started looking at places like Franklin, New York, and really everywhere that I started looking, Schenectady. I'm in the Hudson Valley, so my focus is north of Westchester County and out to the Canadian border to the north towns and out west toward Rochester, Buffalo, and to the south towns. So when I look at this business, I look at them from these areas that are disproportionate in areas of need. The rural community, the whole idea of the MRTA is to provide access to the product and to the plant, right? So if we're talking about those underserved communities, I think that those are communities that we have to look at outside of New York City as well, because those are the areas that I think are going to have a hard time having a sustainable marketplace because the legacy market is so strong in those places, right, to begin with. And we're talking about people who don't have absorbent amounts of capital and so on and so forth. So that's just, my take on it. And that's something, Liz, that we are as a committee committed to making sure that we address that part of the bill. I know I've had conversations independently with everyone on the panel that are part of the committee, and we're open to hearing ideas from others.
Ruben, if I can just say, like I myself wouldn't want to be a part of, trying to weigh out who deserves what more than others, right? Because I think every community is going to really feel passionately about whatever their experience has been due to the war on drugs. But Elizabeth, I think there are some realities and there's some emphasis that can be put on building relationships between upstate New York and downstate, for instance, and that's just based on the different licenses that are available. So for instance, New York City, the boroughs, right? It's going to be very difficult to, I'm sorry. Oh, that's so it's going to be very difficult to find space in the boroughs for cultivation, right? Or for large manufacturing. But that would not be the case in, say, and I'm just going to say Buffalo because I'm from there, but like a Buffalo or like a Rochester, right? Like there's old steel mill, plants or whatever, things like that have not been operating. Land is more open and more vast. And so what I would say, like New York, the state needs to do is to take those geographical things into consideration. And exactly, Rust Belt, exactly. And so how do we take those things in consideration so that we can make sure that the state is able to eat, right? Like the state is able to rise up and take advantage of the opportunities, right? And so as opposed to trying to like fit a square into a round hole, like let's use what we have. Like let's use what the pluses and minuses are based on different geographical areas in the state already. And let's make sure that we highlight those things.
Could I just take a second and point out there are really a lot of areas of agreement. of course, we don't necessarily agree on who should be included, but we can probably all agree on who should not be included. For example, the 10 ROs who are getting the first 10 licenses. Like, we can probably agree that we don't want them to get any more than they're already getting from the bill, right? They're getting a lot from the MRTA. They're getting an exclusive 2-year window to be the only providers in the entire state. They're getting the first 10 licenses, and they're getting 2 years to figure out what the marketplace looks like for themselves first before anybody else even gets to enter it. I mean, there's a lot in there for the MSOs. And then there's a lot of regulations to be developed for the rules of the road. And then, as I recall, there's a fee to be collected from the 10 ROs for that right to get their exclusive access to that multi-billion-dollar. Hold on 1 second. Honey, can we please stop with the kazoo? Daddy's on the Zoom. Thank you. So you know, instead of, not to be repetitive, but instead of focusing on the idea that there's a limited quantity of licenses to be made available at some point in the future, or that there's a limited amount of tax revenue to be redistributed or reinvested that we're all necessarily going to have to fight over, we are still the people of the state of New York, and we have already, honey, please, with the kazoo. And we have told our law enforcement agencies that we don't need them to do the thing that they spend the overwhelming majority of their time doing. And the 10 ROs are going to pay a huge fee for their exclusive window. So what are the best ways for us to attach those funds, which are not hypothetical, like tax revenue, which may be generated at some point down the road, but those fees are definitely going to be collected from the 10 ROs. Where's that money going to go? How much is that fee going to be? How much of that can we attach? And those police budgets definitely have already been allocated going out 10, 15 years. So how are we going to revisit the assumptions that went into those law enforcement budgets that included the prohibition against cannabis?
Well, and just to add to that, Kenny, because we talked about this on our last call, I don't want it to be assumed that the 10 MSOs automatically get to move forward and get, these extra allowances that are in the MRTA, because there's a thing in there, in that language, that says compliance. Are all of the MSOs in compliance? And if they are not in compliance based on the Compassionate Care Act, then I don't think that they should be allowed to automatically get these additional advantages.
Exactly. So I think it sounds like we can all agree that there's going to be a need for some kind of pre-day one legal sales audit.
Yes.
The existing industry and the existing law enforcement structure that's reinforcing cannabis prohibition, that's supporting cannabis prohibition.
Absolutely. And then I saw hands up, but the last thing I want to say also that we shouldn't assume is on the allocation of funds, right? The tax revenue, right? So we know that, look, we have to see what happens, right? However, the 40% that is supposed to go back into communities that have been disproportionately harmed is after operating costs. And so I think the other thing that we need to make sure is that those operating costs are actually reasonable. Like, who is monitoring that?
Nobody.
Because I mean, we might wind up with 40% of a damn dollar. You know what I'm saying? And then as we're talking about the whole of New York State, depending on what that 40% looks like, I mean, that could be pennies being siphoned off to the different areas. So
I'm looking at my notes from the CLE, and it says a 3-year term at $260 a day for administrators in the Office of Cannabis Management.
Right. So that's one of the things that that's one of the areas of opportunity. I won't say problems we have. I don't call problems. I call them areas of opportunity. And that's an area of opportunity that we have as a committee and as an industry association to point out those 3 things. And those are 3 hot things: the assumption of the ROs and their non-compliance or compliance issue, right? Regulatory compliance. We have to make sure that the social equity czar or executive chair of social equity has the oversight and the ability to make sure that that 40% is a real 40%. Liz and I spent some time looking at the bill and looking at this, what we called quote unquote sausage fund or slush fund, right? It was like, there was this conglomerate of, or a mixture of money, and it wasn't really spelled out, and they do it on purpose. They put it at the end of the bill because you're drunk with all the other highlights of the bill. And then you get to that money part, and you know, those of us who are financial people, we look at that money part, and we were drunk and high by the time we got there, and it didn't make any sense at all, right? So, you know, that's what we're going to do, and we're going to make a commitment to that. Ryan, I want to get to you. Ryan Lepore, you had your hand up. Was there something that you wanted to say?
I mean, you know, one of the things I was going to point out earlier is that, you know, I've said this to many people in the room that know me, that a lot of the times when we talk about, you know, how's prohibition harmed populations, you know, when we talk in the context of the city, it's been a race issue. When you leave the city, it ends up being a class issue. But both sects of population have been affected by prohibition and have been oppressed, right? Now, I think that's a very important, you know, distinction to understand, is that, you know, oppression is oppression, right? And we at times forget, you know, again, it was brought up here that, you know, everybody's own experiences, all right, are going to dictate what that definition is. But when you break it down in that lens, it's actually a lot of people really qualify under this you know, definition. The other part of this too, when, you know, we're talking about you know, essentially do the ROs hold up in compliance, you know, there really wasn't strong enough language for them to remain accountable for opening up their future locations, right? For example, in PA, if one of the license holders that's a medical organization doesn't open up a location within 6 months, they can lose their permit. In New York, that never happened. Most of the ROs, especially the latter half of the 5, never had to open up their retail locations, and they only did until adult use became part of the conversation in 2017, and more of these stores started opening up as retail, not even having to open up their cultivation facilities. But the language was never strong enough to uphold it. For me, I felt like they have defaulted on their obligations and responsibilities to medical patients, but the language wasn't strong enough, and that language still doesn't exist. And as I understand, as somebody that has to work with MSOs a lot of the time through my day job, that a lot of them have always just been geared up for adult use, but the state has literally given them that highway. Anyways, I'm sorry, that was more of a comment than a question, so that was all.
Thank you. Before we close, I just want to ask, Colleen, I'll get to you right after I say this. I want to ask all the panelists to please put your contact information, if you would, politely, in the comment section or the chat section, so that people here can get to us if they need to get to us. I'll ask the same thing of our board members to please do the same thing so that we're accessible. And Colleen, why don't you finish us out? And then I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to close us out. But before Colleen, before you go, because I'm not going to speak again for the rest of this night, I want to thank everyone for making this event amazing. I had anxiety. Normally I sleep for 5 hours on the flight out here to LA. And I was up the entire time taking notes, writing, stressing. I was stressing through the night last night before I got on the plane. And I got off the plane, and not only is it, you know, 86 degrees and sunny, it just hit me that this is the moment. This is why I came into this industry. I came into this industry 5 years ago. I was the only one that looked like me as a CEO at all these conferences. I was working for a big Canadian firm, and I wanted to do this, and I wanted to reach back and I'll open the door for not just Black and brown people, but women. My company is 85% women led as well. And I just thank everybody for making this night amazing. I know that it's not easy to get 5 o'clock, get on these Zooms, but thank you. Thank you to my panelists. I'm forever indebted to you, and I never walk away from one of these meetings ever without having learned something from each one of you and each of you who spoke up tonight. So Thank you so much.
Wow. Ruben, that was a great panel and a great discussion. And like we've talked about, this is actually just the first step in an ongoing, or really a middle step in an ongoing process. The 1201 example is great. I love that, Kenny. Couple of quick things. Just as a reminder, May 25th, we're going to be having a forum on homegrown cultivation. I want to point out there's only one thing I hadn't heard from sitting in and being part of these discussions with the group that I also want to emphasize to people. Part of what we're going to need to do is sell this, right? It's what we do as the industry association. That means writing our policy papers and putting out our best way of describing it. But I just want to emphasize one other point, which is that although it's a moral imperative, and I've said this before, but just if anyone hasn't heard it, it clearly is a moral imperative, and this group recognizes that. But for those who even have trouble with that, which all of us would find horrifying, the bottom line is this. If you look at what's going on in California, and you look at us staring at the opportunity of a brand new market, then the bottom line is that legacy markets and social equity applicants who are overlapping in such a significant degree with the legacy market has to come first. There's a very simple reason, because otherwise you're designing the system to fail. In California, you have a two-market system, and the statistic came up earlier that exponentially billions more dollars continue to flow underground through legacy markets than they do through legal markets. And that's because you are putting them out again. Despite what's stated as good legislative intentions, we've seen that mistake happen in state after state. And this really is an opportunity for us to get that right. So to that end, people have asked how they get involved with committees. You can just email us at info@and either nyccia.org or hvcia.org or both. I've said before that, this is part of it. It's not quite in the stream of our day job. So we do get to those emails. It's not always immediate, but we do promise to get to you on that. And what we'd like to do is, if you're interested in the Social Equity Committee, Ruben had his email on the chat. He's the person to contact. If you're interested in other committees or other ideas have come up about what you think these associations can do to help advance the cause of a good, sustainable market that is in harmony with the community and deals with the issues we talked about today, we're inviting that dialogue, because it's from those contributions and from people contributing those thoughts that we form not only our program, but the committees that we want you all to work on. There'll be more information if you just subscribe to our list, our email list on the website. You don't have to be a member to get the emails. We do want you to be a member to be part of the committees, and you can see the terrific work that lays ahead in that regard, in addition to the work we've done. So with those plugs out there, genuine, authentic, and certainly well-meaning, you are all invited to be part of this conversation. I couldn't help but notice that Lando still has his hand up, so I don't know if that was a leftover, but and Ruben, by the way, you didn't have to be the last voice. You're welcome to close this out too, but I didn't want to leave a hand unraised.
Yeah, especially Lando's. No, I just put a link into the chat about an Office of Racial Data Management in the state of Vermont from their Center for Restorative Justice. The idea being that you can't manage what you can't measure, and nobody keeps racial data. So it's possible that suggesting to our regulators that they start to keep that data would be good for that market composition report that's coming up in 2 years.
Terrific. And data collection, as Dave mentioned in the chat, is very important. I do want to just see if Dave has any last words, and then Ruben, if you don't mind, I would love for you to just any last thoughts to sort of propel us. So if we don't mind, just those two, and then we'll say goodnight. Dave.
Yeah, listen, I mean, I just want to first say, Ruben, thank you. It was a great job doing that. And to our panelists, I have been doing this a really long time, and I've been sitting with you all through all the different conversations. I always learn. And to those people who are new to this, we've heard a kaleidoscope of views. I'll use that a lot, but we will narrow that down to a precise view and precision vision of what this industry should look like. And that's what the policy papers are all about. And that's what Albany is waiting for us to provide them. So please join. Your voice is everything to us, because without it, we're going to be lacking that critical element that may make the difference. So thank you all, and that's enough for me.
No, thank you, everyone. I said what I had to say. I look forward to seeing you all in committee. If you're interested, please email me. You can get me at any time. And one final note. I'll say this again, and I've said this earlier. We've climbed the mountain, but we've only reached the plateau. The real work now begins in creating a equitable, sustainable marketplace for cannabis. Just getting the bill passed was not enough. This is where the work begins, when we start shaping the regulations and the enforcement codes and all of those things that go into making a great marketplace. And we can't do it without your voices. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great week, and
Thanks,
we'll see
everyone.
you next time. Thank you.
Colleen,
Thank you.
Christine, Ruben, thanks.
Thank
you.
All right.
And gents.
All right. Kenny Mac.
Have a good one, y'all.
Thanks.